I got hit. I can't believe it. Major Mukund Varadarajan. Yashu Guchan, Jammu and Kashmir, June 2013. Single 7.62 mm shots rang out through the air. The Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorist commander was cornered. Two terrifying odds loomed before him as he crouched with his AK-47. 1. He had a single ammunition magazine left. And 2. The 12-man Indian Army team that had him cornered was led by March Mukund Varadarajan. It was a warm June evening in 2013 and Altaf Baba knew the end was near. One of the most fiercely hunted terrorists in Kashmir, he knew he did not have a choice but to fight until everything faded to black. The apple orchard in South Kashmir's Yashu Guchan village he had chosen as his final hiding place was in bloom, but the fruit would not be ripe for picking until 2 months later. Altaf Baba had not been following a cardinal rule he had learned from his Pakistani handlers. According to that rule, terrorists should keep their weapons in full automatic mode during a firefight with Indian forces to maximize the possibility of inflicting damage. Now down to his last magazine, Altaf Baba had no choice but to fire one bullet at a time to draw the encounter out for as long as possible. Hemmed in by a dozen of the Indian Army's most determined hunters, the terrorist seemed to know that this was his final fight, and that escape was impossible. But he was not the only one counting his bullets. Several feet away, taking cover with his men from the 44 Rashtriya Rifles Battalion, March Varadarajan was counting them too. Each and every bullet fired from within the orchard was duly noted. He is running out of ammunition, March Varadarajan whispered to his buddy, Sepoy Vikram Singh, correctly guessing the reason why the terrorist was not firing a spray of bullets. I will take him down after he has fired 30 rounds. The arithmetic was crucial. A regular Kalashnikov magazine holds 37.62 mm rounds. And March Varadarajan knew how many rounds from his last magazine the terrorist had already fired. 17, 16, 15, 14, half a magazine was left. March Varadarajan knew it was more than enough ammunition in the hands of a cornered, determined, military-trained terrorist to kill at least 5 men before being stopped. He waited, his finger on his weapon's trigger, as the shots continued to ring out. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. With deliberate pauses, Altaf Baba expended the last of his bullets. As March Varadarajan had predicted, the firing stopped. The young major had spent the previous 25 minutes taking cover, and was fully ready for his next move. With Vikram providing cover fire, the 6 feet 3 inches tall March Varadarajan emerged from his position and charged directly at the terrorist's position inside the orchard. Sprinting the short distance in a few long strides, the officer arrived with his weapon blazing. Altaf Baba was thrown off the ground in a hail of point-blank fire, landing with a crunch in the leafy undergrowth, dead. Standing over the remains of the Jaish commander, March Varadarajan took off his bulletproof headgear and fished out a Motorola handset from a pouch in his combat fatigues. He had to report the operation's success to his CO. Altaf Baba, a native of Pakopra, oversaw all terror operations for the Pakistan-supported Jaish-e-Mohammed in South Kashmir. This was a big kill. Sir, there's good news. We got Altaf, March Varadarajan said as he wiped the sweat off his forehead before placing his headgear back on. The terrorist had been killed, but officers and soldiers can rarely afford to let the guard down. How can you be so sure it's him, Maddy? The voice at the other end of the satellite line was Col. Amit Singh Dabbas, the battle-hardened CO of 44 Rashtriya Rifles who was at his headquarters in Zavora Manlo, near the apple town of Shopian. I am standing over his corpse, Sir, March Varadarajan replied. I'm looking at his face. Col. Dabbas, a decorated SF officer, quickly realized that March Varadarajan was no ordinary soldier. The major had been posted under his charge in the Kashmir Valley barely 3 months prior to the incident. It was proving to be difficult for the colonel not to like him. From the day they first met, March Varadarajan was christened Maddy by the CO. I thought he looked like the spitting image of the film actor, Madhavan. March Varadarajan was also from Chennai. So I started calling him Maddy and the name stuck, says Col. Dabbas. March Varadarajan's tactic of counting Altaf Baba's final round of bullets soon became the talk of not just the 44 Rashtriya Rifles, but other battalions operating in South Kashmir as well, a hotbed for Pakistan-backed terrorists. He became known as the 44RR Major, who was so remarkably composed during a firefight that he could actually keep count of the bullets that were fired in his direction. The legend would also be a source of amusement at the unit. Mathematics had never been March Varadarajan's forte, and he would often share with fellow officers how he had a hard time not failing at mathematics in school. On one occasion, when the Altaf Baba encounter came up for discussion during a round of drinks at the unit mess, a fellow company commander joked, "Thank God you didn't goof up with your counting, Maddie. Look at your size. You think that bugger would have missed you." The jokes at March Varadarajan's expense were fine in the atmosphere of brotherhood and bonhomie at 44 Rashtriya Rifles. But not one of them had any delusions about just how crucial the killing of Altaf Baba was for the security forces. The terror commander had been steering an effort to establish linkages between the Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Hezbollah Mujahideen to synchronize and amplify the terror machine's effectiveness in South Kashmir. His killing would be a crucial step forward in the fight against established Jaish and Hezbollah networks in the area. Apart from the dead terrorist, mobile phones and coded matrix sheets found on his person left a trail for investigators. This eventually provided vital leads to help identify routes used by terror cadres and the civilian overground. Operatives supporting, protecting and facilitating them. In the months that followed Altaf Baba's killing, March Varadarajan's focus was on deciphering the codes he had found on the terrorist. And for that, he made repeated visits to the Army's Electronic Warfare Detachment in Srinagar. He was in Srinagar every second day for several weeks to find out what progress the Electronic Warfare Detachment had made, remembers Col. Dabbers. He knew that the codes masked solid details. Cracking the codes became an obsession. The young officer had become unusually convinced that the information that lay encrypted in the codes would lead to bigger terrorist targets and plans. The belief consumed March Varadarajan for weeks. Officers at his unit recall how there was little else he would speak about. 3 months after the encounter, Army specialists finally cracked the codes, allowing March Varadarajan to piece together several vital details crucial to counter-terror operations in and around Shopian. March Varadarajan's suspicion had been proven true. The codes provided extremely specific information. Chief among the secrets they held was a specific reference to a group of houses on a hilltop in Kazipatri village overlooking Shopian town. These houses sheltered terrorists on the transit from the Yawan forests to Shopian and beyond. As soon as March Varadarajan received the classified report, he went to his CO with a satellite map identifying the houses. "Sir, these houses have to be kept under surveillance at all times. We will get something big there one day," March Varadarajan told Col. Dabbers. "But we have to be seen to be totally inactive in that area." 7 months later, in the summer of 2014, as India's longest ever general election reached its peak, March Varadarajan's prophecy would come true. At 1430 hours on the 25th of April 2014, March Varadarajan had just Saturday down to lunch at the 44 Rashtriya Rifles Charlie Company headquarters at Shajimarg in Baramulla when he received a tip-off from one of his ground sources. It was the kind of input that meant lunch would have to wait. Jaish-e-Mohammed commander Altaf Wani was in Kazipatri village. And he was in one of the houses March Varadarajan had identified from the codes. There was not a moment to lose. Ordering his QRT to arm up for the operation, March Varadarajan dialed his CO. "Sir, I have A1 intelligence. Wani is there. I am rushing to the village with my QRT." Altaf Wani had replaced Altaf Baba as the Jaish's divisional commander and was trying desperately to take his predecessor's work to the next level in uniting the suicide squads of the Jaish and the commando-style units of the Lashkar-e-Taiba. Wani had popped up on the army's radar not long after Altaf Baba was killed. Kazipatri, Jammu and Kashmir, the 25th of April 2014. In their squad vehicles, March Varadarajan and his men arrived at the village in less than 30 minutes. By 1,500 hours, the QRT had split into 6 buddy pairs and set up a cordon around the 2-story brick house about which the men had received detailed targeting information. March. Varadarajan then proceeded to do what he always did before operations in civilian areas. He ordered his men to move residents out of the area for their own safety. The house March. Varadarajan and his men had their eyes on that afternoon was the biggest in the village. Its spacious compound included a sprawling orchard and 2 outhouses. March. Varadarajan scanned the setting quickly. Heavy caliber weapons could not be used as the men were not clear how many civilians were still inside the house. Army snipers arrived a few minutes later and took positions on rooftops of neighboring houses. But the sharpshooters had no clear view of the target. They would remain in position, but had no idea what they were aiming at. As March. Varadarajan began a final briefing with his men. He received a shattering additional piece of information from a resident of Kazipatri. Terrorists hiding in villages routinely endanger the lives of citizens, most of whom are too afraid to speak. Others are desperate not to become pawns in the violence and at times break the silence. March. Varadarajan immediately radioed his CO. Sir, it's not just Altaf. There are 2 Lashkar terrorists with him. We are about to make contact. Barely had March. Varadarajan signed off when Kol Dabbas heard gunshots. The battalion headquarters was not far from Kazipatri village. The sound of gunfire is usually the last thing that alarms a soldier. And in this case, Kol Dabbas knew that one of his finest officers was on the job. Even so, he immediately ordered more soldiers from the unit to rush to the location and strengthen March. Varadarajan's cordon. The gunshots that Kol Dabbas heard were the starting point of what would become a fierce firefight. From well-entrenched positions within the house, the terrorists fired at March. Varadarajan and his men, who returned tentative fire as they squinted at the house, trying to figure out where the terrorists were hidden. The gun battle raged on for an hour, but the terrorists' positions could not be pinpointed. March. Varadarajan checked his watch. It was well past 1,700 hours. He knew that something had to be done before daylight faded. Darkness would give the terrorists tremendous advantage. They were probably already planning to draw out the encounter until the sun set so they could slip away from the cordon under the cover of night. March. Varadarajan winced. He knew that was not an option. Allowing Altaf Wani to slip away after having him surrounded would mean the security forces could effectively forget about getting anywhere close to such an opportunity soon. It would be a psychological blow to the men, and a huge morale boost for the Terrakadras. If Altaf Wani managed to escape this encounter, his image would be inestimably inflated across propaganda material as a miracle man, who had outfoxed the army's most hardened soldiers. There were other reasons why that evening's hunt was so important. The terrorists hiding in that house in Kazipatri had killed a polling officer and injured 5 others a day earlier in voting at the Anantnag Lok Sabha constituency. The polling staff was on its way to Shopian when the terrorists opened fire on the bus. Eliminating the men responsible for the murderous attack on the already vulnerable democratic process in the valley went far beyond just kills by a Rashtriya Rifles squad. The day rapidly ended, and with no real forward movement in the fight March. Varadarajan came up with a plan, whispering it quickly to Vikram, who nodded back that he was ready to go. As the other men provided covering fire, March. Varadarajan and Vikram dropped to the bellies and crawled through the orchard. As bullets flew in 2 directions over their heads, the 2 reached the front entrance of the house. March. Varadarajan quickly planted an improvised explosive device, armed it and then motioned to Vikram to retreat with him to a safe distance. At 1,730 hours, in a deafening blast, the front portion of the house came crashing down in a cloud of debris. Not waiting, literally, for the dust to settle, March. Varadarajan and Vikram switched their weapons to burst mode and stormed the house, straining through the murk for the targets. Instantly, they were greeted by a hail of bullets fired by a terrorist who had been half buried in the debris. One of the bullets grazed March. Varadarajan's forearm. A microsecond more and the 2 soldiers would have been shredded, but they both reacted fast, turning their own AK-47 rifles on the terrorist, pumping an unwavering stream of bullets at him. March. Varadarajan took a step closer to the body in front of them. Bullet smoke rose from the dead terrorist. He bent down to get a clear look. March. Varadarajan knew what Altaf Wani looked like. And this definitely was not him. Two more terrorists were still in the house. They had mounds of rubble now providing them with cover. And one of them had to be Altaf Wani. Before March, Varadarajan and Vikram could decide on their next course of action. Grenades came flying through the air from a dark corner of the shattered ground floor of the house. Well trained in room clearing techniques, March. Varadarajan and Vikram dived to the ground, their hands protecting their ears. The grenades exploded feet from the two soldiers, shrapnel smashing off the debris, missing them by inches. The terrorists followed the grenades they had thrown with fire from their assault rifles. Using this as cover, one of the terrorists bolted out of the house and towards an outhouse in a far corner of the compound. As he exited, the terrorist had briefly looked March. Varadarajan's way. And March. Varadarajan saw his face. It was Altaf Wani. March. Varadarajan had gained a formidable reputation for dominating firefights, aggressively ending them with sheer power. His aggression was cold and calculated. There was nothing brash about it. It was Maddy's belief that the man who takes initiative and packs aggression in a firefight is the one who triumphs, recalls Col. Dabbers. It hardly surprised Col. Dabbers, therefore, when one of the officers at the encounter site radioed him with the update that March. Varadarajan and Vikram were now approaching the outhouse to take a cornered Altaf Wani down. The QRT continued to fire bullets at the house where they believed the third terrorist was still hiding. But there was no return fire. March. Varadarajan lobbed a grenade into the outhouse. The blast should have debilitated, if not killed Altaf Wani. But as the two men stormed the outhouse, a volley of fire came smashing into Vikram. It became clear what had just happened. The grenade had killed one terrorist, but there was another with him. Altaf Wani wasn't alone when he fled from the debris of the residence and into the cement outhouse. The second terrorist had fled with him. It was this second terrorist who had been killed by the grenade. Wani had survived. The sepoy returned several rounds of fire at the terrorist, but Wani was shielded by a row of logs stacked in the outhouse and was able to fire his weapon from the confined space he was in. March. Varadarajan saw his body collapse to the ground. Vikram had taken 2 bullets, one had sliced his neck open, while the other had penetrated his jaw. A gunshot through the neck usually spells certain death. March. Varadarajan knew he was about to lose one of the most courageous and dependable soldiers in his team. He knew that not only was his buddy through with this fight, his life too was about to end. As in all encounters, there was not a moment for emotion or mourning. Without pausing for a moment, March. Varadarajan lunged forward with his AK-47 and sprayed bullets at Altaf Wani, killing him instantly. In those final seconds, some of Altaf Wani's shots hit March. Varadarajan. He walked out of the outhouse. He looked okay. We thought he was fine. Recalls an officer in the cordon outside the house. But then he suddenly collapsed. The soldiers were not sure if Altaf Wani was dead. And they didn't know what had happened to Vikram. March. Varadarajan was breathing heavily when he was pulled from the site, but nothing about his demeanor betrayed that he had 3 gunshot wounds and was losing copious amounts of blood from all 3. Yeah, we got him. But sheer bad luck, we lost Vikram. March. Varadarajan said to an officer who was removing him from the site, barely a grimace on his face. And I got hit too. I can't believe it. Then March. Varadarajan lost consciousness. An ambulance had arrived to dash March. Varadarajan to the Army's 92 base hospital in Srinagar, the only place equipped to handle the injuries he had suffered in the firefight. Col. Dabbers had alerted the Pulwama Civil Hospital en route about the officer's critical injuries and asked him to make arrangements to stabilize and possibly revive him before sending him onward to Srinagar. But March. Varadarajan would not make it beyond a few kilometers from Kazipatri village. He died in the arms of his unit's 2IC and the regimental medical officer. March. Varadarajan had celebrated his 31st birthday on the 12th of April 2014, a fortnight before the Kazipatri operation. It is a day his CO will never forget. The colonel was on his way to Srinagar airport to drop off an officer, March. Ashish Dankar, who had completed his tenure at the unit. He decided to pick March Varadarajan up from his company operating base and treat him to an extra special lunch at a luxury hotel. As the officers drove towards Srinagar, one thing needed to be resolved: should they head to the Taj or the Lalit? Col. Dabbas remembers telling March Varadarajan that while the Taj offered a stunningly beautiful view, the other hotel was reputed to serve better food. Sir Peli Taj Chalt Hain, Fear Lalit, sir, let's check out the Taj first, then the Lalit, was March Varadarajan's instant reply. The colonel couldn't say no. The officers went to the Taj first, where they had chocolate brownies and steaming cups of cappuccino, before driving to the Lalit, where they cracked open a few bottles of beer and finished the afternoon with a sumptuous meal. That afternoon was a rarity in the cloistered life that soldiers who participate in operations lead. March Varadarajan wanted the unit's adjutant, March Inkur Dutta, to feel miserable about missing out on the jaunt. So he suggested to his CO that they take some pictures and share them with others in 44RR. When he saw the snaps, he decided against it. He thought he looked too bulky. Of course I shared them. Col. Dabbas later wrote in a letter to March Varadarajan's young wife, Indu Rebecca, 3 days after his death. In the same letter, he wrote, "Now, he, Maddy, is the pillar on which the unit history will rest. The Palton and the army are indebted to him. As his commanding officer, I am grateful to him for the moments of trust and laughter we shared. Whenever he is mentioned, I will walk tall and say, I knew him. He was my finest officer." Men from the unit remember how, no matter how long or hard March Varadarajan's day had been, he was always up for making others feel special on the birthdays or anniversaries. It was the CO's birthday on the 24th of March when March Varadarajan arrived at his house at midnight along with his QRT and the neighboring company commander. He would do that for everyone. That was Maddy. Personal relationships meant a lot to him, remembers Col. Dabbas. Officers of the 44 Rashtriya Rifles say it was March Varadarajan's strength and sheer bulk that kept him alive for over an hour even after taking so many bullets. The way he was bleeding, I knew he would not come out of this. But it didn't stop us from praying for a miracle, says an officer who was part of the Kazipatri operation. Another buddy pair pulled out Altaf Wani's body from the outhouse after March Varadarajan was dispatched from the site. He had gunshot wounds in his head, neck, abdomen and limbs. March Varadarajan had made sure that there was nothing left of him. March Varadarajan's last words would haunt his CO. Col. Dabbas would spend days wondering why the young officer had said, "I can't believe this has happened to me. The only thing I can conclude is that Maddy was so sure of his battlecraft and fighting skills that he couldn't believe they had got him," says Col. Dabbas, who went on to become an instructor at the Defense Services Staff College in Wellington, Tamil Nadu. The day after the operation, Col. Dabbas called the 44 Rashtriya Rifles Subedar Major, the most senior enlisted soldier in the unit, and told him he would like to meet March Varadarajan's Charlie Company. Their morale would have been crushed from the loss of two of the bravest. At dinner, Col. Dabbas broke bread with March Varadarajan's QRT. Few words were spoken. Grief overwhelmed pride that night. In Maddy, I saw a special operative. I could relate to him, says Col. Dabbas. He had the patience to cultivate sources and the aggression to influence the outcome of a firefight. His Charlie Company was very much like an SF unit, says Col. Dabbas. And Col. Dabbas would know. He was commissioned in the Para-SF and later moved to another Para-SF unit. Col. Dabbas would beam with pride as March Varadarajan's QRT would always bag top position during division-level competitions involving 6 teams each from the 9 battalions that were part of Victor Force, which oversees operations in the Anantnag and Pulwama areas of J&K. March Mukund Varadarajan was posthumously awarded the country's highest peacetime gallantry award, the Ashok Chakra, on the eve of Independence Day 2014. Indu arrived in Delhi to receive the award from the President of India on Republic Day the following year. "India should see the man Mukund was, not my sorrow," Indu said that evening in a television interview on NDTV. Indu has since moved with her daughter to Australia to pursue her newfound passion for teaching. I often try my best to explain to my 6-year-old how wonderful he was, and we recently came to an agreement after watching Bahubali that Appa is our Bahubali because he was the strongest and he did the best he could to do his duty. It is true, he was perfect for me, but perfect or not, he did his best, always, says Indu. March. Varadarajan's citation said he personally led the demolition team and used the resources available to him in a critically short time period to bring down the target house. The citation made a special mention of his aggressive action and the avenging of the attack on election officials within 24 hours that had restored the faith of public in democracy. March. Mukund Varadarajan exhibited most conspicuous bravery and exemplary leadership and made the supreme sacrifice while fighting with the terrorists, the citation added. His buddy, Sepoy Vikram Singh, was awarded a posthumous Shaurya Chakra, the country's third highest peacetime gallantry award. Mukund would often ask Indu to promise him that she would never cry if something happened to him in the line of duty. Indu took that promise very seriously. As March. Varadarajan's mortal remains were brought to Chennai, television viewers across the country saw Indu's calm, stoic figure next to her husband's casket, their 3-year-old daughter, Arshia, by her side. There is this moment that I will never forget. Mukund told me that his parents and I were his gods. I could understand him extolling his parents, but I was scared when he put me up on that pedestal. I tried to explain to him that I am just human, Indu recalls. He saw it differently. He called our daughter his God too on the day she was born. He really did love and respect us as much as God. How can you not be blown away by that kind of love? She, Indu, would often say she would pull through because she had made a promise to him. We draw strength every day from Indu's composure and demeanor, says Col. Dabbers. The Ashik Chakra that March. Varadarajan was awarded posthumously was not the first decoration for gallantry that came his way. His CEO had originally planned to recommend March. Varadarajan for an award in June 2013 for the Altaf Barber operation. But March. Varadarajan would not hear of it. Such recommendations are always confidential, but the young officer had learnt about the honor in store for him. He marched to the CEO's office and insisted that if someone had to be recommended for an award, it needed to be 2 young soldiers from his company who had played the role of scouts during that operation. Sir Bahut Badiya Kam Kiya Undonan Ne. Wo Award Ki Hadar Hain, both of them did a tremendous job and deserve the award, March. Varadarajan pleaded. He got what he wanted. The 2 men were awarded the Senar Medal for gallantry shortly thereafter. The 5-page letter Col. Dabbers wrote to Indu was drenched in the emotions of a CEO who respected and admired a soldier 8 years his junior. Each one of us who knew him will find our own way to overcome the loss. Grief will fade away and when it's gone, only one thing will remain, pride, he wrote. To be honest, every day is a struggle for his parents and for me, says Indu. It should not come as a wonder that some days are tougher than others. For his parents, he was the son who loved them to bits. He had pet names for all of us and we yearned to hear him calling us by those names. We yearn for a sighting of his dimpled smile that could warm our now frozen hearts. It has not been easy and it is not going to get any easier. The trick is to conceal the struggle and will yourself through a day as happily as you can because that is what he would want. The toll it has taken is no joke and can be seen in my daughter too. She often hides Mukund's pictures because she is worried that either I or his parents will feel sad. It proves that she has definitely taken after him in terms of concern and love, and that is the silver lining in an otherwise cloudy situation. Mukund's favorite quip over drinks would always be that he had already won the toughest battle of his life, convincing his traditional parents to accept his love for and intention to marry a woman from outside his community. In August 2009, aged 26 and barely 3 years into the army, Mukund and Indu were married. It wasn't easy getting married, recalls Indu. There are words that were thrown at both sets of parents by some relatives and the community that were difficult to stomach, but we were selfish in our love and had parents who stood by us irrespective of their misgivings. My parents took a little longer because they were giving away the precious daughter. But what held me through it all is the faith that we had in each other and his acceptance and understanding that I couldn't do without my parents. I knew he would wait, and I knew his ideals were the same as mine. It took us 5 years to convince my parents and then tie the knot. To have lost all that in a few moments is never going to be easy to come to terms with. There are days when it gets really difficult to accept that the man who said that he will stand beside me and show the world how our relationship will survive whatever life throws at us is no longer with me. 3 years after they got married, in December 2012, March, Varadarajan would arrive in the Kashmir Valley to become part of the 44 Rashtriya Rifles. Folklore surrounding March Varadarajan's memory remains. If unit officers had something tricky to discuss with the CO, they would get March Varadarajan to articulate it to the boss. He would give it an operational twist and leave me with little choice but to agree to whatever was put forth to me, recalls Col. Dabbers. Apart from being an outstanding operations man, March Varadarajan is remembered for his ruthless wit. Everyone in the unit knew that if March Varadarajan was looking particularly happy, somebody was certainly having a miserable day. The young officer missed his parents, Varadarajan and Geeta, tremendously. He knew he could not speak to them every day, but when he did, he would devote an hour if he could to his mother. March Varadarajan had dreamed of shifting his parents to a brand new apartment in Chennai. The purchase had been finalized a month before his death. After he was gone, and as the family grieved, it would be the first thing that Indu ensured. Indu will never forget her last conversation with Mukund that April morning when he departed on his final operation. We had just had a silly fight a few days ago, and the fight was, as always, about how I needed more time with him. We got over it the same day, as both of us would rarely leave a fight unresolved. On the morning of the 25th of April, we had a short and ordinary conversation. He asked for Arshia and spoke to her over the speaker, and we told him that we missed him. He told me to take Arshia out and enjoy the day, do some shopping and cheer up, and that he loved us too. He hadn't been getting much rest, often coming back early in the morning after patrolling and calling me to wish me a good day before getting a few hours of sleep before he had to be up and about again. We said our goodbyes a little earlier than usual that day because I knew he was busy and needed some rest. Ironic, isn't it? Col. Dabbas's WhatsApp profile picture is not his own, and his status message reflects the image, Mukund and Vikram. Salute. He hasn't found the heart to change those settings for more than 3 years. And they remain a constant reminder of two of the finest soldiers the SF colonel had known, 2 soldiers he thinks of every day, 2 young men he will remember all his life. I think of them every single day. They were lost on my watch, says Col. Dabbas. On the colonel's study wall are framed pictures of March Mukund Varadarajan and Sepoy Vikram Singh. Indu remains in touch with her husband's battalion. The army never leaves anyone behind, and we are a family more than just a group of people tied together by a common profession. They have been with me with words of comfort and all forms of support. I am confident that they will stand by me as I will stand by them in the future as well, she says. Death on the battlefield is the ultimate privilege for a soldier. We don't go there to die. But if it happens, we have to turn it around into a celebration, says Col. Dabbas. Only soldiers who have bled together in combat will understand that.